alcohol, marijuana, nicotine, cocaine, caffeine, heroin. All of these drugs begin with plants.
Even a drug like crystal methamphetamine can trace its origins to the ephedra plant. The local variety here in Utah is known as Mormon tea. Drugs exist throughout nature, and their use to produce intoxication occurs in animals far older than man. It seems that as long as blood has flowed through human veins, drugs have flowed with it. And wherever you find the phenomenon of intoxication, so too will you find the problem of addiction.
Of all the questions we can ask about addiction, there is one question that stands out. All the other questions about addiction begin with this one, and everything hinges on the answer.
The most important question about addiction is simply this: is it really a disease? When I first came to treatment for my own problem with addiction, my counselors told me that addiction was a disease. As a physician, I was skeptical. Addiction's not a disease, it's a choice. Diabetes is a disease. The diabetic didn't choose to get it, but the drug addict did have the choice to start using drugs. Cancer is a disease. It befalls an unfortunate person through no fault of their own. But addicts, they do this to themselves. That made sense to me. But the more I expressed my sympathy for the argument against calling addiction a disease, the more my counselors told me that I was in denial and that I needed to surrender. Well, they were right, I did. But as a doctor, I believe that patients have the right to ask questions. And as a patient, I wasn't satisfied with the answers I was getting. A lot of people told me that addiction was a disease, but very few of them could defend that position. And I had to know.
So I decided to find out for myself. And that set me on a personal journey that has taken the last 10 years of my life. Along the way, I've come to realize that this question is far more complex than it looks. And finding the answer takes more than medicine and science. Our path travels through philosophy, law, politics, even history. I began my search just trying to make sense of my own addictive behavior. I quickly discovered that I had stumbled across one of the greatest intellectual puzzles of our time. There are many arguments against calling addiction a disease, but the best argument I've ever heard is one I call the choice argument. The choice argument says that addiction can't be a disease because drug taking is a behavior and all behaviors are choices. The choice argument goes on to say that even though an addict might tell you he can't stop drinking or using drugs, that he's powerless over drugs and alcohol, really he can stop anytime. That's right, addicts can quit anytime they want.
You just have to help them make the right choice. To show how easy it is to get an addict to stop drinking or using drugs, the choice argument suggests this simple experiment. I take a bottle of alcohol, pour out a glass, and put it in front of the alcoholic. And I offer it up to him. Go ahead, Mr. Alcoholic, take a drink. No, really, it's on the house. But when the alcoholic reaches for the glass, I add a small twist. Oh, but Mr. Alcoholic, if you do choose to take that drink, then I'm going to blow your brains out. Most alcoholics will choose not to drink. We won't. And that's the choice argument's point. With a strong enough threat, I can get the addict to stop their behavior in a way I just can't for real patients with real diseases. Diabetes, for instance. You can't put a gun to the head of the diabetic and say, okay, better bring that blood sugar down to 100 or I'll blow your brains out. It's not going to work. The choice argument draws a distinction between behaviors and symptoms. In the case of symptoms, those are part of a disease process. Free will plays no part. We don't hold patients responsible for their symptoms because they can't choose not to have them, and that's why punishing and coercing real patients is inappropriate. But drug taking is a behavior. All behaviors are choices. Free will does exist. The addict is responsible for their behaviors because they can quit if they choose to. You just have to motivate them to make the right choice. That's the choice argument. That's the best argument I've ever heard against calling addiction a disease. And I think it's a darn good argument. But it has problems. And in the end, I think the choice argument is wrong, because it fails to take into account some exciting new research about the brain. Research that shows that our capacity for choice is far more complicated and fragile than we ever imagined. Is addiction a disease or a choice? The short answer is, addiction is a disease of choice. It's a disorder of the very parts of the brain we need to make proper decisions.
So now that we've looked at the argument against calling addiction a disease, let's try to make the argument for calling addiction a disease.
I think the first step in making that argument is just to admit up front that the behavior of addicts can be very unpleasant. I'm not arguing that. Addicts can be frustrating, they can be revolting, they can even be criminal. But just because we're dealing with bad behavior, that does not mean we can automatically assume that what's causing that behavior is some intrinsic badness. And yet, when we talk about addicts being liars, cheats, and thieves, or having an addict personality, that's exactly what we mean. The problem is, we've made this mistake before. Doctors of the past have looked at groups of people and attributed their behavior to a moral failing or a personality disorder or race or gender or ethnicity, and then later realized they were wrong. These behaviors were in fact symptoms of a disease. There is a long and painful history in medicine of making this sort of mistake. So if we say that addicts are liars, cheats, and thieves, or that they have an addict personality, or that they grew up in a bad social environment or had bad friends, perhaps we should take the time to ask ourselves, how do we know we're not making the same mistake again with addicts?
I'm not denying that addicts act badly, and I'm certainly not arguing that addicts should be let off for those bad acts.
What I'm arguing is, just because we've got bad acts, that does not mean we can automatically assume bad actors.
So perhaps you can see that the question of whether or not addiction is a disease is at heart a question about causality. I'm seeing bad behavior, yes, but what's the cause of that bad behavior? How do doctors get to the cause of disease? What is the causal model they use to describe illness?
What is disease? What does it take to get into that disease club, like diabetes and cancer? Well, this is a tough question, because it's hard to get a consensus definition of disease, even within medicine. If we're ever going to have any hope of showing that addiction is or is not a disease, we need a definition of disease that is so tough and so rigorous that everyone can agree on it. Then, if we could fit addiction to that definition, the argument should be won, or if we can't, lost. To find that tough definition of disease, we have to go back in the history of the word disease.
Our modern concept of disease, what doctors call the disease model, is only about 100 years old. It emerged from germ theory, from the work of early microbiologists such as Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. The disease model says that you've got an organ, it gets a defect, and as a result you see symptoms.
It doesn't matter what the organ is, bone, liver, kidney, whatever. The defect is a physical cellular defect. Cells die, cancer develops, an infection perhaps, and if a person has that defect in that organ, they will show certain signs and symptoms. That might not look like much, but that is actually everything that doctors do. And what is this model? It's a causal model. I'll show you how it works.
Let's say you go skiing. You ski too fast and hit a tree. You might get a defect, a fracture, in an organ, your femur. If so, you will show the symptoms of a broken leg. The disease model tells the doctor where to go. After the symptoms, no, doctors do not chase symptoms. They fix the defect. and with time and healing, the symptoms go away.
That's an illness that doctors can cure. Let's look at one that they can only treat.
This is diabetes. This time the organ is the pancreas. The defect is the death of cells that produce insulin, and every one of the symptoms of diabetes can be traced back to that defect in that organ. Before doctors had the disease model, they tried to chase down and fix each individual symptom, and it didn't work. Most diabetics died in childhood. But once doctors started using the disease model, it told them exactly what to do. You simply replace the insulin, and if you do it correctly, the symptoms of diabetes disappear.
The disease model rescued medicine from all those bad explanations of disease: morals, personality, race, gender. And it was so powerful a model at revealing the true cause of illness that it changed the world. The disease model doubled the human lifespan in only 100 years.
And 100 years ago, doctors knew that. They knew that this new, modern, scientific definition of disease would make the new, modern, scientific profession of medicine powerful too. But they also realized that they had to figure out, right away, what was a disease and what wasn't. Who would be a patient, and who would medicine wash its hands of? It was easy to see how broken legs and diabetes fit the disease model. So doctors ruled that these were diseases, and the people who had them were patients.
But how did addiction fit the disease model? What was the organ? Was it the brain? Was it the liver? What was the nature of the defect? 100 years ago, no one knew these things. And the symptoms of addiction, well, they just looked like badness. When doctors could not readily fit addiction to the disease model, they declared that it was no longer a disease, and that addicts were no longer patients. That didn't mean that addiction just disappeared. It meant that another group in our society had to handle addiction. And that group is the criminal justice system. As a result of that decision made by doctors almost 100 years ago, today in the United States we have 2.3 million people in prison. And most of those people are there for one thing: drugs, or alcohol, or the things that people do on drugs and alcohol. When you get into numbers like 2.3 million people, this isn't a criminal justice problem anymore. This is a public health catastrophe. If we knew the organ involved in addiction, if we understood the defect, and if that defect in that organ explained addictive behaviors, unpleasant as they are, then addiction would fit the disease model, and all of this would end.
For nearly 100 years, medicine has been unable to do that, and the problem of addiction has fallen largely to the law.
Until today. In the last 20 years, there has been an explosion of understanding about the brain and addiction. Today, neuroscientists do know the parts of the brain involved in addiction. They know the nature of the defect, and that defect in that organ shows that the behaviors of addicts are in fact symptoms of a disease.
The brain is an organ of places. Different areas handle different functions. There is a motor area of the brain so we can move, a vision area so we can see. Even our most cherished memories begin in specific places in the brain. Now that we know the history behind our journey, we can begin our exploration of this vast and largely undiscovered territory, the landscape of the mind.
I wonder what it would be like if I could walk through the brain the way I can hike through Utah. I find the comparison quite striking. The brain has bumps and grooves, the same way this land has mountains and canyons. The brain is shaped by experience over the course of a lifetime, the same way this land is shaped by wind and water over countless lifetimes. One is made of genes, the other geology. When I compare the anatomy of the brain to the geography of Utah, it helps me understand that the brain is a place. We can go to these places, we can see how they connect, we can even photograph them. There are two areas in the brain that are important in addiction. One is deep inside, the midbrain. The other is on the outside. It's called the frontal cortex.
If we landed on the surface of the brain, we would find ourselves walking on the bumps and grooves of the cortex.
The bumps are called gyri, and the grooves are called sulci. 500,000 years ago, the primate brain exploded in size to become the human brain that we have today. As the brain grew, it folded on itself, so it had more surface area, and that's why the brain is wrinkled. All of our conscious lives, all of that thinking, feeling, and speaking, everything we see and hear and taste and touch occurs here in the cortex. Our memories are here, carved somehow into the brain, like these petroglyphs left by the Native Americans, or these names carved into the rock by the Mormon pioneers. But the parts of the cortex that we're interested in, the bumps and grooves that matter most to us, are up there in the frontal cortex.
It is the triumph of evolution, the frontal cortex. Morality, judgment, personality, all the things that make a conscious, self-aware being are realized up here in the bright sunlight of rationality.
It's up here in the frontal cortex where we evaluate the world, where we weigh options and understand consequences. This is where choice is conceived. The frontal cortex is also where we give things emotional meaning. This is the part of the brain where we attach. So this is where a mother loves her child. This is where we love mom back. The frontal cortex is where we select our romantic partners and our friends. This is where we give things moral meaning. And this is the part of the brain where we give things spiritual meaning. It's easy to see how doctors once believed that the defect of addiction was here in the frontal cortex. If this is the thinking, loving, moral, spiritual, social choice part of the brain, then drugs must somehow break the frontal cortex to create all that nasty addictive behavior. It's a powerful idea that drugs work in the frontal cortex and that addiction is due to a moral failing or a personality disorder or a bad upbringing. There's only one problem with that idea. It's wrong. Addiction does not begin in the frontal cortex, and drugs do not begin their work up here. Where do drugs work? Deeper down, in a far older part of the brain called the midbrain.
When we descend into the brain, we go back in time, tracing our evolutionary history down to the ancient survival areas of the brain, the areas we still share with animals, and that we held on to as our species evolved because they were so good at keeping us alive. The midbrain does not think. It does not make choices or understand consequences. It handles the next 15 seconds. It gets us from moment to moment alive.
The midbrain tells us to eat. It tells us to defend ourselves, even kill. It fires our sex drive. These are all behaviors that are critical for survival. And to make sure we do these behaviors, the midbrain makes them pleasurable. Ordinarily, the frontal cortex keeps the midbrain in check. It exerts a top-down control over the unconscious survival impulses of the midbrain.
But in addiction, this top-down control fails, and the midbrain becomes more powerful at guiding behavior than the cortex. In other words, in addiction, something goes wrong at a level of brain processing long before morals or personality or choice. Now, how do we know all of this? That drugs work primarily in the unconscious survival midbrain and not in the rational decision-making cortex? We know this because of a very famous set of experiments done in the 1950s on mice. The midbrain's role in reward was discovered by Dr. James Olds and Dr. Peter Milner. They found that a mouse will press a lever to deliver a tiny electric current to two very small but very specific areas of the brain, the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. And not only will a mouse press a lever to deliver an electric current to these two areas of the brain, that's all he will do. He won't eat, he won't mate with other mice. If you put an electrified grate in front of the lever and shock the mouse, he won't step off the grate. He just keeps on pressing that lever, ignoring all other survival drives, until he dies. Olds and Milner had discovered the pleasure centers in the brain. Our brains have these same two areas, and the nerve pathway that runs between the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens is known as the pleasure circuit. Later, scientists discovered that a mouse will press a lever to deliver drugs to these same two areas. And again, that's all he will do. He won't eat, he won't mate, he sits on that electrified grate and fries, and keeps on pressing the lever until he's dead. So mice can get addicted to drugs. Big deal. Well, think about it. Drugs produce a very powerful, rapidly fatal addiction in a mouse. A mouse has no personality. A mouse does not weigh the moral consequences of pressing the lever. There are no mouse gangs selling drugs to other mice, and yet, mice can still become addicted. Studies like these dramatically weakened the idea that addiction was caused by bad morals, or a personality disorder, or a bad social or family environment. These things might accompany addiction, but they cannot be the cause of addiction. These mice studies showed that in addiction, the drug hijacks the survival mechanism of the midbrain. Now the drug is in the #1 survival spot. The solution to starvation is no longer eating, it's the drug. And the relief from being burned by an electrified grate is no longer in simply stepping off that grate. The relief is in the drug. The drug and survival are now so close together that as far as its addicted midbrain is concerned, they're the same thing. In other words, the drug and actual survival are indistinguishable. And when that happened, we crossed the line into addiction. Most people, around 9 out of 10, are on this side of the line. They are not addicts. They've never used drugs. They experimented with drugs a long time ago. They occasionally use drugs. Maybe they even abuse drugs. But for those 9 out of 10, the drug is just the drug. But when we cross the line into addiction, the drug is not the drug anymore. The drug is life itself. If the alcohol abuser gets a DUI, what does he do? He quits. The abuser can bring the negative consequences of his drinking to bear on his decision-making, because for him, alcohol is just alcohol. But the choice is not the same for the alcoholic. He wants to quit, he's tried to quit, he's endured catastrophic consequences in his life because of his drinking, but try as he might, he cannot quit, because alcohol isn't alcohol anymore. It's the main way of getting through the next 15 seconds alive. So in addiction, something goes wrong with the very part of the brain we use to tell those things that are good for survival from those things that are harmful. A neuroscientist would call this the brain's hedonic capacity. We can simply call it the brain's pleasure sense. And yes, we do have a pleasure sense in the brain. For instance, we can tell the difference between things like broccoli and things like chocolate cake. And why do we have a pleasure sense? Because we have to be able to tell the difference between things like broccoli and chocolate cake. If we're starving to death and someone brings us a truckload of broccoli, well, we have to know that's not going to do it. Broccoli will not save your life from starvation. But chocolate cake will save your life from starvation. And so to identify and prioritize those things in the environment that are good for survival, the midbrain makes them pleasurable. In addiction, this is the sense that breaks. Now think about that. If you can't perceive light correctly, that's called blindness. No one is going to question your morality if you're blind. If you can't perceive sound correctly, that's called deafness. No one's going to try and throw you in jail or take away your child if you're deaf. But that word pleasure is very morally loaded. It comes with a lot of moral baggage. And so perhaps you can see how a person with the defect in their pleasure sense is far more likely to be interpreted as being immoral than they ever are as something akin to deaf or blind. What addiction is a defect in the brain's ability to perceive, process, and then act upon pleasurable experiences. And it's because this brain disorder is about pleasure that these patients are seen in moral terms and they go to prison by the hundreds of thousands.
How does the brain create a pleasurable experience? What happens when we enjoy a piece of chocolate cake? And what would happen if that process should break?
We mentioned earlier that the first big thing discovered about the brain was its feature of localization. Different areas handled different functions. Today, neuroscientists focus much more on how these areas communicate with each other and how neural pathways projecting from one area of the brain to another area of the brain help the brain assemble its processing into complete thoughts and perceptions. When the brain creates a pleasurable experience, it brings several levels of processing together into a pleasure construct. The best way to show how this happens is to think about something pleasurable. For instance, a cookie.
But not just any cookie. This is a very special cookie called a Madeleine, made famous by the French author Marcel Proust in a legendary passage known as the episode of the Madeleine.
One day in winter, as I came home, my mother, seeing that I was cold, offered me some tea. I declined at first, and then, for no particular reason, changed my mind. She had sent out for one of those short, plump little cakes called Petite Madeleine, which look as though they had been molded in the fluted scallop of a shell. I raised to my lips a morsel of the cake which I had soaked in a spoonful of the tea. No sooner had the warm liquid in the crumbs touched my palate than a shudder ran through my whole body. An exquisite pleasure had invaded my senses. And suddenly, a memory returns. The taste was that of the little crumb of Madeleine which my Aunt Léonie used to give me on Sunday mornings at Combray, dipping it first in her own cup of lime flower tea.
Proust stumbled across the phenomenon of involuntary memory. When he put the cookie into his mouth, it brought back a flood of memories and emotions from his childhood. He didn't ask for these memories to come back. They lay dormant for years until they were triggered by the taste of the cookie. This is the way the brain creates a pleasurable experience. It brings rewards, smells, taste, places, memories, and even emotions together into a single sensation. We don't experience these different levels of processing individually. The brain weaves them together into a unified perception. In addiction, something goes wrong at every level of brain processing as the brain tries to generate a pleasurable experience and fails. Addiction is pleasure unwoven. There are 5 theories currently used in neuroscience to explain addiction. These theories don't conflict. They fit together quite nicely because each one describes what's going wrong at each level of brain processing as the brain creates a pleasurable experience. The first theory describes the genetics of addiction, with the blueprint that creates the brain in the first place. The second theory describes what happens in the midbrain, where the earliest unconscious part of a pleasurable experience starts. With that reward processing are the memories that are part of a pleasurable experience. Eating a Madeleine cookie relieves the stress of hunger, so next the stress system becomes involved. And as we go from level to level of brain processing, we climb higher and higher until finally we find ourselves in the frontal cortex, the part of the brain where we attach emotionally and make choices. Genes, reward, memory, stress, and choice. This is the pleasure of eating a cookie deconstructed into its separate parts. What this layered feature of brain processing implies is that any one level of brain processing contains the levels of processing before it.
They fit inside each other, a bit like Russian nesting dolls.
If there's a problem in the first level of processing, genetics, that problem will be passed up to the next level of processing, reward. If there's a problem in the reward processing, that will then become part of memory processing. The memory processing will then be handed up to the stress processing, and by the time we reach the frontal cortex, the area of the brain that deals with choice, things have gone very wrong indeed.
We all have a femur. Therefore, we are all at some risk of breaking a leg. Same with the brain. Because we all have a hedonic system, we are all at some risk of becoming addicted.
Some people, though, are more likely than others. The blueprint for their brains, their genes, leaves them more vulnerable to addiction. Genes can create differences in how people respond to drugs. Dr. Mark Schuckett at the University of California at San Diego has found a genetic difference in the way people respond to alcohol. Some people are genetic low responders. It takes more alcohol to get them drunk, so they drink more. Their genes make them more vulnerable. Other people are genetic high responders. Their genes make them less vulnerable. Somewhere between 40 to 60% of the vulnerability to addiction is purely genetic. But genes are not enough. They can get a person to addiction faster, but something in the environment has to turn those genes on. When it comes to facing environmental challenges, some people have resilient genes. Much the way this rock, because of its chemical composition, is hard rock. The water flowing over it barely dents its shape. But some rock is soft rock. Water shapes it quite easily. Water shapes rock the way the environment shapes our genes. Our experiences, both good and bad, change our brains. Some brains are resilient brains, kind of like hard rock. They can take a lot out of life and not get too bent out of shape. But some brains are more vulnerable. If they were exposed to drugs and alcohol and a rough environment, it might not take much to get them addicted. It might seem like hard rock is always better rock. But if all rock were hard rock, think of what we would miss. We might never know the beauty of rock shaped by water. Likewise, it might seem that it's always better to have a genetically resilient brain. But if a person had the genes for addiction, became addicted and then recovered, well, that person adapted to the problems of life. Nature favors adaptations, sometimes over resilience. A parent with a strong family history of addiction might pass those addiction genes onto their child. But they pass on something else too. They pass on their sobriety. All the work that parent does to secure their sobriety, that benefit goes to their child. And so when their child goes out into the world, they don't go alone. They go with the parent's recovery. Genes are powerful in addiction, yes, but recovery is more powerful. Take that Madeleine cookie. We take a bite, it tastes good, and we say yum. At the very core of that yum, the earliest brain processing in a rewarding experience is the release of the chemical dopamine by the nerve cells, the neurons, in the midbrain. Neuroscientists used to think that dopamine was the sole chemical of pleasure. Now they understand that dopamine handles just one particular but very specific part of a larger pleasurable experience. Dopamine tells the brain when a reward is salient, noticeable, important, and when a reward is better than expected. Dr. David Reddish of the University of Minnesota explains dopamine's role like this. Let's say you're at a gumball machine, and you want to buy a gumball.
So you put in your quarter, and due to a freak of gumball machine physics, you get
2 gumballs. This is when the midbrain releases dopamine. Dopamine tells the brain when a reward is especially good, better than expected, and to pay attention to that reward because it might be better than other things in the past for survival.
So let's say you put another quarter into the gumball machine, and this time you get 1 gumball.
This time the midbrain does not release any excess dopamine. It's not that the gumball doesn't taste good, it's just not a reward that was better than expected.
Just to push your luck, you put 1 more quarter into the gumball machine, and this time you get no gumball.
This time the neurons in the midbrain release less dopamine because this reward was worse than expected. It's in this way that dopamine acts as a learning signal to help the brain identify, prioritize, and then anticipate new and unexpected rewards over older predictable rewards. Dopamine is a chemical of pleasure, yes, but it handles one specific piece of pleasure. Dr. Terry Robinson and Dr. Kent Berridge of the University of Michigan believe that dopamine is more about drug wanting than drug liking. It's the first in what will be a series of neurochemicals, a kind of hedonic cascade that will create that larger pleasurable experience.
What all natural pleasures have in common, things like food and sex, is their ability to release dopamine. But drugs cause huge surges of dopamine, far greater than the brain was ever meant to handle. Drugs fool the brain into thinking they are much, much better than expected.
Every time the addict uses the drug and they get that surge of dopamine, their brain gets a message that the drug is better and better than expected, even though it's not, and has greater and greater survival value, even though the drug doesn't deserve that survival value, and it goes higher and higher on the survival priority list.
And the drug climbs the survival list until finally it is in the number 1 spot. Now for the addict, the drug is survival.
And it's this irrational assignment of value that lies at the very heart of one of the most frustrating but fascinating features of addiction: persistent drug use despite negative consequences.
If we were to lay out all the drugs that release dopamine, we might arrange them the way chemists arrange atoms into the periodic table of the elements by their class, structure, and properties, except we will call our arrangement the periodic table of the intoxicants. We would have the usual drugs like alcohol and marijuana, cocaine and nicotine, but we would also find classes such as the stimulants, which contain crystal methamphetamine, or the entactogens, which are drugs that induce feelings of interpersonal closeness, such as ecstasy. We would also find the entheogens, drugs that create experiences of mystical significance. These used to be called the hallucinogens. They differ from the dissociants, drugs such as PCP and ketamine. Here's a big class, the sedative hypnotics. These are drugs that decrease anxiety and promote sleep. This would include drugs such as the barbiturates and the benzodiazepines like Valium and Xanax. Here are two sedative hypnotics that have a more recent history of abuse, GHB and Zolpidem, sold under the trade name Ambien. Down here are the opioids. These are the classic narcotic pain relievers: morphine, heroin, methadone. Here's hydrocodone, that's the main ingredient in Vicodin, an ancient one, opium, and an important newcomer used in the treatment of opioid addiction called buprenorphine. At the bottom of our periodic table of the intoxicants, we find the inhalants and the anabolic androgenic steroids.
This is the dopamine hypothesis. What all addictive drugs have in common, whether they are uppers or downers, strong or weak, legal or illegal, is their ability to release dopamine in the pleasure areas of the brain. One immediate implication of the dopamine hypothesis is that if a person has a problem with one drug, they have a liability to develop a problem with any or all of the others.
For instance, cocaine addicts often come to treatment quite willingly, but they make the mistake of refusing to stop drinking alcohol. Dopamine surges continue to insult the brain, and they find that they keep relapsing back to cocaine. Or the alcoholic who tries to stop drinking by switching to marijuana. When things get stressful and their craving kicks in, it's likely that they will be led back to alcohol. Likewise, people who are newly sober from drugs like heroin or methamphetamine, who continue to chain smoke or drink huge amounts of caffeinated beverages, they are still creating very small but real spikes of dopamine. Their craving may get worse.
But what makes the dopamine hypothesis especially powerful is that it shows us that not only chemicals release dopamine, behaviors can do so as well.
And there are people who can manipulate these behaviors, things like food, gambling, sex, and codependency, to get the same kinds of dopamine surges as the people on the chemical side. This is called cross-addiction. If a person tries to quit their chemical addiction but doesn't stop their behavioral addiction, they may have a very hard time staying sober from both.
Once the brain has found something that is good for survival, it has to remember it. The brain uses a second neurochemical to do this, glutamate. Glutamate is the chemical of memory formation. It lays down memories of natural rewards like food. But drugs cause such huge surges of neurochemicals that glutamate locks the drug into memory. And everything that goes along with the drug, the people, the place, the time of day, the sights and smells of the moment, they become part of that memory. They are now drug cues, and if a person is ever exposed to that drug cue again, the other thing that glutamate does is it begins the motivation to get the drug. Glutamate is the chemical of drug memory and of drug seeking. The dopamine neurons send their reward processing up. They project from the VTA to the NA, and then to the frontal cortex. Now the frontal cortex becomes involved. It sends glutamate neurons back down to the midbrain. As the brain generates an experience of pleasure, the neurons going up release dopamine. And the neurons going down release glutamate.
Normally, this up and down communication enables the brain to recognize and learn those things in the environment that are good for survival.
Dopamine says, hey, this is important. Glutamate says, okay, I'll remember. Dopamine says, hey, I really want this. Glutamate says, fine, go and get it. That's the way this elegant but delicate system was meant to work. For food, for sex, for Madeline cookies.
Drugs go straight to this mechanism and wipe it out. These surges of neurochemicals are like flash floods tearing through the landscape of the brain. Each use of the drug, every flash flood, ravages the brain's delicate physiology, sweeping away everything in its path.
With time, deep channels are carved into the brain. Drug pathways become stronger and stronger. Normal pathways become weaker and weaker. Dr. Stephen Hyman of Harvard University calls addiction a pathological overlearning of the drug and all that goes with it. This isn't a normal memory. This is a drug hypermemory, and these memories may be permanent. They leave the addict vulnerable to relapse even after years of abstinence. There are three things that are known to cause relapse. Drugs, because they cause surges of dopamine. Drug cues, because they affect glutamate. And stress, which causes the release of the neurohormone corticotropin releasing factor, or CRF. The theory that explains the role of stress in addiction was developed by Dr. George Koob of the Scripps Research Institute in La Jolla, California, and Dr. Michel Lemole of the University of Bordeaux in France. Koob and Lemole refer to the brain's stress system as its anti-reward system because CRF acts to counter dopamine surges. If dopamine gets too high, for instance during a binge drinking episode, the brain pushes back with CRF to restore balance. Ordinarily, the brain maintains this balance or homeostasis around a hedonic set point, much the way it maintains body temperature around the set point of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. During an infection, the brain resets its body temperature set point and we get a fever. The brain's hedonic system works much the same way. With the repeated dopamine surges of drug use, the stress system is chronically overstimulated and the brain can't maintain homeostasis. So what does the brain do? It gives up on homeostasis and reverts to what Koob and Lemole call allostasis. Allostasis is the process of regaining stability through change. And what changes? The brain's hedonic set point. In a desperate attempt to restore balance in the face of chronic drug use, the brain resets its pleasure threshold. Balance is restored, yes, but at a cost. Normal dopamine releases from normal pleasures no longer register, and the brain's pleasure system goes flat. Psychiatrists have a word for this state of the brain. They call it anhedonia. Under severe, prolonged stress, the brain becomes unable to derive normal pleasure from normally pleasurable things. Since normal pleasures no longer register, this person is essentially pleasure deaf. If you take them to Disneyland, everyone else has a good time, but they say, I don't get it. So what does register? Things that release so much dopamine that they reach the new pleasure set point. And what things do that? Drugs. These dopamine surges cause the brain to lock onto the drug. From now on, anytime the brain is stressed, it goes straight to the thing that it knows is best at relieving that stress, and that's the drug. And this connection of the drug to survival is below the level of consciousness. Relapse is a process that is underway long before the addict is ever aware of it. I think this goes a long way to explaining why addicts have a tendency to relapse at precisely the most inopportune moment. The day before their court hearing, the day before the big job interview or the family reunion. It looks like the addict doesn't care about these things, but that's not what's happening. It's when they get stressed, they relapse. They don't know why, it just happens. And so finally we find ourselves back in the frontal cortex, where the brain processing that deals with choice occurs. All that problematic processing before, in genes, reward, memory, and stress, arrives here, where the problem is only compounded. Far from being aloof from what happens below, the frontal cortex is entirely dependent upon it. Rationality, judgment, and choice are only possible if the hedonic and emotional processing the cortex receives is accurate. Free will, it turns out, is completely contingent upon the proper function of feeling. The theory that describes what goes wrong in the frontal cortex during addiction was developed by Dr. Peter Kalavas at the Medical University of South Carolina and Dr. Nora Volkoff, the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. They recognize that dopamine is important in the early stages of addiction. But the final common pathway in addiction is the glutamate neurons projecting back down from the frontal cortex. Kalavas and Volkoff's research is based on an important new tool that has only recently become available to neuroscience, the technology of brain scans. Brain scans are essentially photographs of the brain in action. Now, what these brain scans say exactly is still controversial, but Kalavas and Volkoff have found abnormal activity in the brain scans of addicts in two important areas of the cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. These areas are critical for emotional attachment and decision-making. Kalavas and Volkoff believe that the abnormal activity here is the basis of the overwhelming importance the brain gives to drugs and the uncontrollable urge it feels to seek them. In addiction, the normal top-down control of the cortex over the midbrain simply fails. The addict's prior commitment to quit, their memory of what happened the last time they drank or used drugs, the love they feel for their family, the knowledge of the punishment they know awaits them if they relapse, when the cortex fails, these things are invisible to the addict.
Kalavas and Volkoff call this brain state hypofrontality. What was once a healthy, functional, decision-making frontal cortex is reduced to a shadow of its former self. Overactivity in some areas of the brain, and other areas, desolation. This is what lies behind the denial, the personality changes, the breathtakingly impaired decision-making in combination with the tragic loss of insight that characterize end-stage addiction. Addiction begins as a disorder of genes and pleasure, but it ends as a disorder of choice. Hypofrontality gives the addicted brain a powerful tool to protect the connection of the drug to survival, and that tool is called craving. Craving is a difficult concept. We all use the word craving. When people say they crave chocolate, what they mean is they really want chocolate a lot. It's important to understand that's not what the addict means when they say they crave. Craving is an intense, emotional, obsessional experience. The addict wants to think about other things. Their brain is constantly bringing them back to the drug. They are up in the middle of the night. They can't sleep. Their pulse is at 120. They're thinking over and over again, just one more time. That's craving, and make no mistake, that is genuine suffering.
And I think it's the presence of craving that defeats that choice argument.
You remember the choice argument. Addiction's not a disease because the addict can quit anytime he wants. Go ahead, put alcohol in front of the alcoholic, and when he reaches for it, you point a gun at his head, and he will choose not to drink. And that's true. With a gun to his head, the addict can, in that moment, choose not to drink. But even though the addict isn't drinking or using, he's still craving. He doesn't have the choice not to crave. Once that connection of the drug to survival has been carved into the brain, you don't actually have to have drug use anymore for the disease process of addiction to be active. The choice argument fails because it measures addiction by the addict's behavior. In doing so, it misses the most important feature of addiction to the addict, the craving. The other thing the choice argument doesn't quite get is that if you put alcohol in front of an alcoholic and a gun to his head, he doesn't think, oh, I better not drink or I'll get shot in the head. No, what he thinks sounds more like this. I wonder if he'll really shoot me. I wonder if he's even got bullets in that gun. Maybe his finger will slip off the trigger. I wonder if I can get that alcohol into my brain before the bullet comes crashing through my skull. That's craving, and that experience is as miserable as it is involuntary. But this brain state is not permanent. The brain can heal, and recovery is possible. In fact, people get sober all the time. Some go to AA or NA, but there are many different paths to recovery. And what all these people with stable recovery have in common is that they stop doing the things or curtail the things that cause dopamine surges. They learn to cope with craving and drug cues. They become very good at managing stress quickly, usually in a social or spiritual context. And with time, the frontal cortex regains control over behavior. The power of choice is restored. And eventually, the hedonic system comes back online. And normal pleasures, once again, become normally pleasurable.
Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, the brain's hypofrontality resolves, and the recovering addict's capacity for choice is restored. As long as they manage their addiction on a daily basis, people in recovery can make the choice to stay sober.
Now we have a working definition of addiction. Addiction is a stress-induced defect acting on a genetic vulnerability in the reward learning areas of the midbrain and the emotion choice areas of the frontal cortex.
And the symptoms of addiction are loss of control, craving, and persistent drug use despite negative consequences.
We have organ, we have defect, we have symptoms. We have met the burden of proof. That is why we can say without the slightest shyness that addiction is a disease. And something very important happened once addiction became a disease. Addicts became patients.
What does it mean to say that addiction is a disease and that addicts are patients? To me, it means that addiction now has parity with all other diseases, and addicts are equal to all other patients. All the rights that diabetics and patients with broken legs enjoy, addicts now receive. It's not enough to say that addiction is a disease. There are major ethical obligations that go along with that statement. We may have to rethink some of the things we often allow in the treatment of addicts. Things like coercion and punishment. Otherwise, addiction treatment itself runs the risk of becoming an argument against calling addiction a disease.
The brain is a land that is only recently opened for our exploration, and as our journey progresses, many of the things that we find along the way might be threatening, because they may question our long-held beliefs about the nature of choice and personal responsibility. But far from weakening our concept of choice, I think this new neuroscience strengthens it, because it shows us that choice is a very precious, very human capacity, one that needs to be nurtured and practiced, and on occasion repaired. In the end, addiction is about choice. It's about choices like this one. What kind of society do we want to be? Do we want to go down as the greatest incarcerator in human history? Or do we want to be the one that used this new knowledge to make a finer cut between badness and disease? Addicts aren't supposed to contribute much to society. Their behavior is so shocking we hardly recognize them as patients. But addicts do give something very precious to all of us. They teach us how choice works. When do we have it? When does it fail us, or we fail it? What are the conditions under which choice best operates, and how do we set those conditions so that people can in fact make healthy choices in accordance with their values? These are questions that philosophers have struggled with for thousands of years. Addicts are trying to tell us the answers. If we choose to listen, we might know a great deal more about who we are, what we can do, and where that will take us.